August 1944, and 6-year-old Sheila Fox had just finished school for the weekend to make her way to where she lived on MacDonald Avenue, a 10-minute walk away. But she would mysteriously disappear, seemingly into thin air. And despite many years of police investigations, Sheila has never been found dead or alive. Her disappearance has become a huge mystery. But from 1944 and the disappearance of Sheila Fox, 4 more horrifying cases took place not too far from where she disappeared from. You had Patricia McKeown, you had Brenda Hulme, you had Jack Quentin Smith, and you had David Lee. 4 more young children that would be attacked by a person unknown. But what links them together, and why in Farnworth? Why in this small town on the outskirts of Bolton? The school in which Sheila Fox and indeed Patricia McKeown once studied at, where they used to go, is just on our left, and it is St James's. And in 1944, on the 18th of August, and after Sheila herself had finished for the day and indeed the weekend, she would have made her way out of St James's, more than likely along this stretch of road, to make her way towards MacDonald Avenue and to number 3, where she lived with her parents and her family. Now, myself and Vicky have arrived in Farnworth, and it is mid-morning. It has gone past 10 o'clock, closer to maybe 11 o'clock now. And as you can see, it is extremely quiet. Now, a lot of these houses are still here, and they were here back in 1944. There is some new builds that we have walked past, but for majority, what you're seeing now is what would have been here more than likely in 1944. But as you can see, it's extremely quiet. Now, back in 1944, and especially after school, Sheila would have walked along here to a certain point before her disappearance. And there's a lot of theories. There are 1 or 2 witnesses that came forward who say they saw Sheila on the handlebars of a man's bicycle. And we'll get into that shortly. And there's another witness that came forward saying she spoke to Sheila, who was with a man, and she asked her what she was up to, where she was going. And Sheila just simply replied, "I'm going with that man." We don't know exactly where these witnesses saw Sheila, so we're not even going to pretend we know where they saw her. But more than likely, she would have walked along where we are now and heading towards number 3, MacDonald Avenue. And like I said, it's only a 10-minute walk at best. Now, what I find amazing when it comes to lack of witnesses, when it comes to Sheila's abduction, is, as you can see from some of the footage, it really is a close-knit community. There's semi-detached houses on either side of us throughout this area, and MacDonald Avenue, Parkfield Avenue, and many of the other avenues. They're all tightly knitted together. And yet somehow Sheila mysteriously disappears. She vanished into thin air. Like I said, some witnesses said they saw her on the handlebars of a bicycle. How true that is, I don't know. Because we're talking about little children, young children, who are witnesses. Can they be relied? Can they be trustworthy? I'm not saying they were lying, but could they have got Sheila mixed up with somebody else? It really is a strange one. And especially, like I said, it's a close-knit community. You can just feel it. You can just sense how closely knit it is. It's very quiet. So how did she disappear in plain view? I mean, and let's not forget, this was mid-afternoon. It wasn't night time. It wasn't dark. It was mid-afternoon. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon. It was August, so it wasn't even dark as such. But how did she disappear in plain view? And it really is a puzzling story.
But if it's true, what that little girl said, she said she was going with this man, that clearly identifies she didn't know the man because she would have used the name.
Who would have used the name Sheila?
Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Would Sheila have used the phrase, I'm going with that man or this man? Surely she would have mentioned him by name. I'm going with Dave, I'm going with Steve, I'm going with Peter.
If she knew the
person. Because the family seemed to think that Sheila wouldn't have gone with a stranger. She was very reserved, very quiet. She would only have gone with somebody she knew and trusted. Now we are starting on the corner of MacDonald Avenue, and we do have to be mindful that emotions are still quite raw here. But it is here where Sheila herself used to live with her family, her parents, at number 3, and I'll put an arrow over now so you know exactly where that house is. So we do have to be mindful that there are still a lot of people locally who may have relatives, who may have family members who still live here, who lived here back then. And obviously we don't know the area, so we are going to be mindful. We're not going to walk up to the house, it is in front of us, but we will put an arrow over and show you guys, like I said, where Sheila was making her way to her former home at number 3, MacDonald Avenue. Now as we walk our way through this neighbourhood, I'll try and talk over the footage with this one because I want you guys to see what we're seeing and MacDonald Avenue as it is now. Because nothing, or very little I should say, will have changed in all those years. And this is the neighbourhood, like I said, where Sheila Fox used to live. And as we're saying further back, you can just see how close-knit the communities are around here. The houses, terraced houses, semi-detached houses. It really is, and I keep saying it is a bizarre case how a young girl, a 6-year-old girl, she can literally just disappear off the streets in broad daylight. Now interestingly, David Lee, good friend of Jack Quentin Smith, he also lived on this same avenue as Sheila Fox, MacDonald Avenue. We don't know the exact house number, but we know it's along this stretch of road where we've just walked along. So you've got Sheila Fox, MacDonald Avenue, you've got David Lee, MacDonald Avenue, and coming up is Ramsey Avenue. And that is where Patricia McKeown used to live. So that's 3 innocent little victims, 3 who lived within a few hundred yards of each other. So there's a pattern emerging now, and the perpetrator, the person that committed these awful crimes, did he live local? Did he have local knowledge? Why these 3 children in particular, who all lived along the same stretch of avenue, same stretch of road? It seems a strange coincidence that 3 of them all lived within just a few hundred yards of each other. It was by the end of August that several cyclists who had given rides to children on the bikes on the day of Sheila's disappearance, they'd been ruled out after inquiry. All these witnesses, these cyclists, they had alibis, they had stories, and they could back up their whereabouts. But the man that was seen with Sheila, or apparently Sheila, when she was on the handlebars, he had been riding on Newbrook Road near Atherton. And the little girl on the crossbar, she wore a green dress and had ribbons in her hair. Now we know Sheila had a green coat and she was wearing pink ribbons. Now the witnesses who came forward said that the child was aged between 5 or 6, and the cyclist has headed off towards Lee, riding past Atherton Parish Church. Now another interesting aspect of Sheila Fox's disappearance was a letter was received by the parents not too long after her disappearance. And this letter maintained that Sheila was seen in a gypsy caravan. Now the police, obviously, they did their homework and they visited all the known gypsy caravan sites in the area, in and around the area. Nothing toward came of that. There was still no proof that Sheila had been abducted by gypsies or any other person who they'd interviewed, the witnesses who came forward, people such as that. So it was another dead end for the police. So where was Sheila? And like I said, what happened to her from 1944 to present day 2024? Somebody out there may well hold the clue. They may hold the key to solving Sheila Fox's mysterious disappearance. Now, it was just over 12 months later, and in October 1945, when 6-year-old Patricia McKeown, who had just left school, she was approached by a man somewhere here along Newbury Methodist Church in Farnworth. This man came out of nowhere and asked her if she would run an errand for him, but she panicked and she refused. Now, this man grabbed hold of Patricia by one of her arms and dragged her into an entry. It was there he then stabbed her in the arm. Now, she screamed and she managed to flee. She was one of the lucky ones. Patricia's attacker, he was described as being medium height, thick black hair and bushy eyebrows, green eyes, a long pointed nose and dirty teeth. And he was dressed in dark clothes with a Macintosh and did not wear any hat. Now, as I was saying, Patricia was one of the lucky ones. And she would make a full recovery, albeit shocked and a little bit worried that perhaps her attacker may well come back. It is very difficult to know exactly where the attack on Patricia took place. We know she was dragged into an entry of sorts, so it may well have been just alongside that building, or it could have been alongside the church itself. We have tried looking and delving into it a little bit more, but unfortunately we just can't seem to pinpoint where that attack took place. However, we do have photographs from a newspaper showing the police, and they are searching the cemetery, the graveyard, for any sign of any clue, such as maybe a weapon used, which was used to stab Patricia in the left arm. And we'll put those photographs over so you can see what we're trying to explain. But it was along somewhere in this location where that entry was, probably still is, but we just don't know whereabouts it actually is now. But it was later when another attack would happen or occur on another young girl, and this time that young girl was Brenda Hulme. Brenda Hulme, she was 9 years old, and on the day of her attack, she again was making her way to St James's Primary School, and it was along Pigott Street, where we're heading towards now, where that attack would take place. Pigott Street, as you can see, it is quite a long stretch of road. And it was somewhere along here where Brenda, like I said, she was accosted by a person of unknown. Now, she screamed and her attacker fled instantly. So just like Patricia, Brenda was also one of the lucky ones. Now, and I don't mean to say lucky ones in a disrespectful way, but when we consider what was to come next in 1948, then you'll understand why I do use the word lucky. Now, obviously for Brenda and Patricia, they weren't lucky at the time, mentally, physically. They would have been scarred perhaps for life. Because at the end of the day, when somebody gets attacked, that person has to live with those thoughts, those feelings, and try to deal with them best they can. So obviously they weren't lucky themselves, but yeah, in context of what is to come next, you'll understand why I use the word lucky. Now this, or I should say the first attack which occurred on Sheila Fox in 1944, it is just over 80 years ago since that occurred. So me and Vicky have just been talking off camera, and obviously if this attacker, this person, was, I don't know, in his early 20s, let's argue, he's going to be most certainly dead at this point, we feel, because he's going to be over 100 years old. But it's just that question, isn't it? Would somebody who this person knew, would they have had an inkling that it was that person, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense? Would he have give anything away to a work colleague, family member? What do you think? Do you think somebody still knows to this day who was responsible for Sheila Fox's disappearance? Or do you think somebody has got an inkling? Maybe not know for sure, but they have an inkling.
I don't really know. Because it is a difficult one. If you did what you took somebody, do you keep that to yourself, or do you have to at some point release and confide in somebody as an out? I don't really
as an outlet,
know.
because it's a lot of pressure to live with, isn't it? You know,
or I suppose some people can live with that because that's the type of
no empathy,
yeah.
no emotion. Could they keep it a secret for 80 years? You know, and like I said,
some people I bet could, but some people constantly live a lie.
but it's but to snatch
know.
a young 6-year-old kid, God knows what they did or he did with that child, and live with it for so many years, at least 80 years, if not slightly less, because obviously if he died at a younger age.
But then again, if you confided in somebody, you would expect that somebody to have a bit more about them, especially
to
children.
go to the authorities, especially with children, correct?
So it's difficult.
But it is 80 years ago, just over 80 years ago, when Sheila disappeared, and like I said, that the perpetrator would be in his hundreds now, early hundreds. So I personally think he'll be long gone. But it's if he give any clues to family members, you know, friends, acquaintances. It's interesting because it does make you feel and wonder: is there somebody locally who 100% knows maybe, but they just can't go to the authorities, are they out of fear of repercussions, or can they prove they know who did it?
I don't know. I just think if he had confided in somebody, you would have expected, especially in children's child.
Yeah. You think somebody would come forward, even anonymously.
Yeah.
Even anonymously.
But it's how the family have lived, not knowing what happened to their daughter.
Yeah. So this is the entrance or the starting of Ramsey Avenue, and it is on the house just there on the corner. But if you make your way along here, it will take you along and around all of Ramsey Avenue. And like I said, it's there where Patricia McKeown used to live with her family. So you've got Ramsey Avenue, and then at the end you have got MacDonald Avenue. And now, just to add a little bit more mystery to this story, it is very, very close to here where events would escalate in 1948 to an extent where two young boys, we've already mentioned one, and that was David Lee, but his good friend Jack Quentin Smith, he would be found brutally murdered just directly in front and past those new build houses. And we're going to go there now and tell the story of Jack Quentin Smith and obviously his best friend David Lee. Of April 1948, when Jack Quentin Smith, who was aged 11 years old, along with his good friend David Lee, who was only 9 years old, they had both left the Highfield Primary School and they were making their way back home, but along the way they used to play in these fields directly in front. Now obviously things have changed. It's now, I think it's a school playing field now. It's locked off to the public. But these used to be wastelands, and there used to be a pond which we're going to walk past shortly and explain more in detail as this story goes along. But also, Jack Quentin Smith used to live in the house I'm pointing to now with the red arrow. So as you can see, that is the former home of Jack. The pond used to be just where the arrow's pointing now. And I keep mentioning pond because it does become part of the story in more depth shortly. More tragically, at the end of the fields is where a murder would take place, and that was the murder of Jack himself. So you can see just how very close he was to his home when the attacks took place on himself and on David. Now we are going to go to the area where that attack took place and where Jack's body would ultimately be discovered. And we'll get more into that story and David's story as well, because it's miraculous as well it is. it's also sad. So that is Jack's house there on our right. To my left is where I keep talking about a pond used to be. And it is here where the wasteland once was. It's now, I think, part of St James's High School. This was all wasteland back in 1948. Now, we do have a newspaper photograph showing 20 police officers all sifting the wasteland just in front of this pond. And we know it is here where that photo was taken. We can use old Ordnance Survey maps, we can use Google Maps, and like I said, we can also use that photograph to pinpoint exactly where those officers were, and it was just here. So with that being in mind, we also now know where Jack Quentin Smith and David Lee were attacked. And it was just set further back where the new builds are. And there is an old railway path we can walk along. And we're going to take you guys directly to where that attack took place. Now, wrongly, a lot of investigators, a lot of authors have placed the attack on Jack Quentin Smith and David Lee in a completely different area. The newspapers back in 1948 always said that the attack on Quentin Smith and David Lee occurred close to the old Bolton to Manchester railway line. It wasn't. The newspaper reporters, the journalists, they got it wrong. Why they got it wrong, I don't honestly know. The old railway line where this attack took place was the Worsley to Bolton line. Again, we can prove this. We're going to put maps over to show you guys. So whatever you may have read or heard, ignore all that. And we're not bigging ourselves up with this, but we have spent over a month researching this story, and especially more so on the Jack Quentin Smith story and David Lee. We've gone through historical records, crime scene photographs, so we know 100%. We can pretty much hand on heart say the attacks took place just here. We've also dug up an old newspaper article from the 1970s, and it's an interview with David Lee himself. Now, obviously, he's a lot older. And he would say in that newspaper article that he had pushed the attack on him and Jack, his best friend, to the back of his mind for all those years. And it was only when he suffered from a car accident, it all came flooding back, and that's when he began to talk about it. In that article, it also shows a crime scene photo of a disused railway bridge with most of it knocked down. And there's arrows pointing to where Jack's body was found. More importantly, you will see railway tracks running. Now, we can match that photograph up with, again, an old Ordnance Survey map. We also have another photograph of police sifting through this field and where the new builds are. And again, you'll see railway tracks splitting to like a Y shape. And again, we can put an old OS map over to show exactly where those police officers were back in 1948. So where Jack Quentin Smith used to live with his parents was on Bradford Road. It is now today known as Lucas Road, as you can see on the sign. But back in 1948, all this was simply known as Bradford Road. And again, the maps do back this up. Now, this story, a lot of people have written about, like I was saying further back, on Lucas Road or former Bradford Road. Nobody really ever talks about the possible links between the attack on Jack Quentin Smith and David Lee, the attacks on Brenda Hulme and Patricia McKeown. They never linked them together with the Sheila Fox abduction. But newspapers back in the 1940s and 1948 in particular certainly did so. They would begin to give MacDonald Avenue a bit of a sinister name, and they would associate a character known as the Terror. So it became the Terror of MacDonald Avenue, the Terror of Farnworth, or the Farnworth Terror. And it's kind of reminiscent of, I mean, I don't like to glorify it, but kind of a bit like the Michael Myers story in Halloween, where Michael Myers left a mental asylum and made his way back to Haddonfield. And he became known as the boogeyman or the bogeyman, depends how you want to pronounce it. And when you think about it, this is kind of similar in nature. This character of unknown was terrorising young, innocent school children, not adults, not teenagers, young school children, either before or after they finished their lessons at school. They were making their way home or making their way to other family members when the attacks took place. But why here in Farnworth, and why here in close proximity to each other? All 4 children, not 5, we're going to mention 4 children, Sheila, Patricia, Jack and David, all lived within several hundred yards of each other. We're not quite sure where Brenda Hulme lived. It may have been along Pigott Street. We've tried to look, but we just can't seem to find where she lived. But 4 out of the 5 children certainly lived within a few hundred yards of each other. Did this person either know them or had seen them? They might not have known him. They might have seen him before, but not know of him. But if they had seen him before, then surely the descriptions would have kind of got the police to the culprit, if that makes sense. It's a bizarre one. But yeah, the Bolton Evening News and many other newspaper outlets started to call this the terror, the attack of the terror. And it's quite a sinister and ominous phrase or use of word. Now it's where those new build houses are, just where the arrow is now pointing. There used to be a big pond there, and we have a photograph, as I was saying earlier, of police officers sifting through fields close to the railway line which splits into the Y shape. But if we pan our camera further to the left, you will see Jack's former home just in the distance over there. And that is how close he was to where he would be murdered. And the pond is just to the left. So if you come back to the right, it is less than a quarter of a mile away walk just towards the end of the path on which Vicky's now stood on, where Jack Quentin Smith and David Lee suffered that horrific attack. Where Vicky's now stood, we feel is within extremely close proximity of where the disused bridge was, where the attack on Quentin and Jack took place. We're going to walk just up this little pathway in a second, because there is something I want to show you guys. But the photograph that's in the 1970s newspaper and the interview with David Lee, it does show the ruins of the bridge collapsed, and it also shows where these new houses are. These weren't here in the photograph, but it does show, like I said, the police crime scene. And you'll see Quentin's house further in the distance. You'll see the railway line going across. And like I said, the article points out exactly where this attack took place. But it is here, more certainly here. And we also know that Jack and David were on an embankment lighting fires. And if we look to our left, you can clearly see an embankment. So it's somewhere around here, or it may be slightly further in that direction. But it was along this stretch, regardless, where David and Jack would encounter this mysterious person. So this is what I just want to show you guys. It does look like some form of stonework, which could have been part of the old bridge, which used to go maybe across in this direction. The attacks on both David and Jack were horrendous in nature. David Lee gave an interview with the newspapers and a description of the attacker. And he would tell the police that Jack and himself were on these embankments just around here, lighting fires, doing what boys would do. This mysterious character came along and said, "You can't light fires here." He then remembers being told to lie down and not move until this character came back. The police seem to think that David was attacked first. He was stabbed in the upper part of his chest, just above the heart, from what I believe. He was also slashed and stabbed in the lower abdomen area, the groin area. He then collapsed. When he came to, he was in so much pain and fear, he managed to scramble a few hundred yards and make his way back to MacDonald Avenue. How he did this, it's incredible. He was suffering a lot of pain and he was bleeding badly. He collapsed at the gate. He was then taken to the Bolton Royal Infirmary. and it was only there he was then told of the murder, the death of his best friend Jack. Now, it was whilst he was obviously being taken from his home to the Bolton Infirmary that search parties, people from nearby MacDonald Avenue, came out to look for Jack Quentin Smith, and it didn't take them long before they found him. And they found him not far from where David would encounter his own attack by this stranger, this person of unknown. And Quentin Smith, he was taken slightly further away where his body would be found, and his head was bludgeoned. He'd also been stabbed by a sharp object. Quite a few articles of his clothing were removed and placed into a heap somewhere away from where Jack's body was discovered. Now, it's a bit confusing now because some police officers said this wasn't anything to do with sex, it wasn't molestation, they weren't abused in any way. But then in other articles, other officers said that obviously with the clothes being removed, with David being stabbed in the groin area, it was most definitely sexual motivated attacks on these two young boys. We'll never know that for certain, for sure, but it does seem a bit strange how Jack Quentin Smith had his clothing removed and dumped not far from where his body would be found. David Lee, he spent 10 days in hospital before he was deemed fit enough to leave. But his life changed for at least 18 months in terms of being protected by the police. The police would watch over him, they would guard him for up to 18 months later because he was now a prime witness in, obviously, the murder of Jack Quentin Smith, his best friend. He was the last person to see Jack alive, but he could also identify the attacker in more detail. Now, his description is quite close to the descriptions given by several other boys who came forward, obviously within days of this attack taking place. And 5 boys at different times came out saying that they remembered seeing a tall, thin man wearing dark clothing and with grey hair, similar to which David himself would also tell police whilst he was in hospital. Another description was given similar, but this time this man was seen driving a light blue van. And this was near the Empire Cinema in Farnworth, so not too far from where these attacks all took place. So could this person, who these 5 boys had described in detail, have been the same person who attacked David and Quentin? Seems highly likely. The descriptions pretty much matched that of David's. Obviously with the attack on Jack Quentin Smith and David, resurfacing old wounds, the memory of Sheila Fox and how she disappeared 4 years prior would obviously come to the fore. And all the men who were interviewed back in 1944 would be interviewed yet again by the police. And it was in 2001, detectives began digging up a garden of a house that stands on the route that 6-year-old Sheila herself would have taken as she walked home from school all those years ago. Now, they acted on the tip that a man had been seen digging in a back garden in the Farnworth area after midnight around the time that Sheila went missing. And this digging itself was witnessed by neighbours, and they said the boy himself, well, the man at the time was a boy, he was a schoolboy himself. But when the police went to look into this, it was now in his 70s, because obviously the years have gone by. Now, authorities established that that man was Richard Ryan, and he was a convicted rapist. Now, he died back in, I think, the late 1980s or early 1990s. Now, the police, after digging the gardens of where Richard once lived, it was somewhere along Barton Road, and it's a road where we've just literally walked down. It came to nothing. The gardens were dug up, nothing was found, no trace, nothing of Sheila Fox. So that was one line of inquiry that was obviously shut down. And to this day, Sheila Fox, her disappearance has remained a mystery ever since, and it's over 8 years ago since she sadly went missing. It's really is a cruel twist of fate. And like I said, the police, they dug into the archives, into the files in 1948. Obviously, when the attack on Jack took place, it opened up old wounds, old memories of the Sheila Fox disappearance. And a lot of theories were mentioned, a lot of conspiracies were spoken about, a lot of whispering went on who it could have been. Now, David Lee, when he was being interviewed by the police whilst in the Bolton Royal Infirmary, not only would he give this description of this character who attacked him and his friend Jack, he also said he spoke in a Lancashire dialect, a Lancashire accent. The police obviously assumed that this assailant knew Farnworth very well. He may well have been one of their own, a local man, a local young man at that. You see, the description David gave put him in the age brackets between 25 and 35. We're going to get into a little theory of our own shortly, who we believe who may be responsible, and it is just a theory. We don't think anybody's ever tied the two together before, but it is just one suspect, in my opinion, who it might not make any sense, I don't know, but hopefully it will. But I've looked into his history, and he is a known serial killer from the 1950s. He would have been 18 years old at the time of the attack on Jack, and he lived nearby towards the Wigan area. So half an hour away, if that. So quite feasible that this person may well have been responsible for the attacks on both David and Jack. I don't think, well, he most certainly wouldn't have been involved with the Sheila Fox disappearance because he would have been too young. But I kind of, well, I've got a theory on who I think it may be. The only reason why we keep bringing up the ponds close to Quentin Smith's, or Jack's house, Jack Quentin Smith's house, the police dredged the ponds. They actually emptied the pond closest to Jack's house to search for the weapon used on the attack on himself and on David. Eventually, I don't think it was the pond itself, but a knife will be discovered, a pocket knife, a schoolboy's pocket knife. But the police didn't, well, they couldn't find anything conclusive to say that that is indeed the weapon that was used to kill Jack Quentin Smith. We know he was bludgeoned over the head with a large stone or boulder, but he was also stabbed by a sharp object. But the police couldn't prove beyond a doubt that this weapon that they found was indeed used to kill Jack, as well as obviously stab David himself. A few weeks later, another knife was found, and again, nothing concrete could be proven that it was this weapon. But they did drain that pond, and there was another pond closer to where the former Greenfold Farm used to be. And Greenfold Farm was also searched when Sheila Fox went missing back in 1944. 4 years later, the same pond would be dredged, would be searched. And it seems Greenfold Farm itself may well hold clues. I don't know. Again, it's just another bizarre theory that was mentioned, because Greenfold Farm, I'm not sure it's there anymore, but it was at the centre of all these attacks, the ponds where the children used to play, where David and Jack used to play. The police dredged the pond there, didn't find anything. But Greenfold Farm was mentioned quite a few times during these attacks over a 4-year period, a 4-year span. Vicky said earlier that Sheila Fox's family seemed to think that Sheila herself was quite anxious around people. She was quite shy, but she wouldn't trust strangers. She would never go off with strangers. Now, me and Vicky have spoke about this in some detail for quite a while, haven't we? Mm-hmm. And we all like to believe, don't we, that children would never walk away with strangers. I kind of disagree with that. I mean, we're talking about a 6-year-old girl, and if an older man has said to this young girl, Sheila, come with me, your family's asked me to come and pick you up, and he was so adamant, so firm, I personally believe Sheila would have gone with this chap based on, well, not a threat, but maybe a firmness.
Because this was back in 1940.
This was back in 1944. Obviously, children were allowed to roam freely, weren't they? They were allowed to go to and from school at such young ages. Adults trusted other adults more, didn't they?
Yeah.
Doors were left open, babies left in the prams outside the houses, safe and sound. You know, our neighbours could walk in and out of each other's houses, no problem. The streets were a lot safer, or they were supposed to be, meant to be. So, would Sheila have... Would she put up a fight? Would she have basically said, no, I'm not coming with you, I don't know who you are? I think with enough persuasion, Sheila would indeed have gone with this person, this man.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to victim blame. Before anybody comes on saying you're victim blaming now, we're not doing. We're just trying to go back and see how easily a young child could be manipulated into doing what an adult wants them to do.
Mm-hmm.
So please, before anybody does come out and say it, or always blaming the victim, we're not doing.
We'd never blame children either.
Well, we'll never certainly blame children, never.
No.
But we're just trying to go through all the plausibilities.
Yeah.
I'd like to think my children wouldn't go with strangers. The youngest is now 18. And even now when she goes out with her friends, I said to her, don't go off with anybody you don't know. Watch your back all the time. She's 18, she's an adult. And even I'm still doing it now. So a 6-year-old, I can kind of understand why they would go off with a stranger. And especially if the stranger is maybe said, oh, your mum, your dad, whoever, there's someone to come and pick you up, jump on handlebars and I'll take you home.
I'm back in that
I'm
day.
back in 1944 when people were more trustworthy. Jack Quentin Smith, he was buried on Friday the 16th of April in 1948. And there were large crowds of women, most of them who were pushing prams, and they had young children with them. Now they all gathered near Jack's home along Bradford Road and along the route towards the cemetery and where we are now. And this is Farnworth Cemetery, not too far from where all these horrific attacks on these children took place. Now it was reported that there were over 400 police officers of some degree also in attendance, not just in the cemetery itself but along the route taken by the cortege. And these police officers, you could say they were undercover, they weren't wearing police uniform, and that was to mingle with the crowds and to listen out for possibly any stories, any confessions, or anything that may have been spoken about in small circles throughout the community of Farnworth. So perhaps the person responsible for these attacks, may have said something which has perked the curiosity of a member of public. And these police officers who were mingling in with the public, maybe they were just hoping to overhear something. Like I said, a tale, a confession, maybe a rumour, anything that may have pinpointed as to who the murderer of Jack Quentin Smith was, the person involved with the attack on David, and perhaps the person responsible for the abduction of Sheila Fox and the attacks on Patricia, McKeown and Brenda Hulme. Now we've had a walk round Farnworth Cemetery. We've been here now over 2 hours, and we have brought a single flower with us to place on the grave of Jack Quentin Smith. We also know he's interred with several of the family members, especially his sister Sarah. But we can't find anything close to grave number 2313. I mean, when I say that, we have found 2,000, and what was it, Vic? 2,207 or something like that.
2236.
2236. So we're like 100 away. But what they've done here at Farnworth, and this isn't us complaining by the way, but they have cut a lot of the overgrown grass and they've just left it scattered on the base, if you will, where the actual headstones are, and they've covered up the names, the dates, and it's just making it nigh impossible for us to locate the final resting place of Jack Quentin Smith. And it's sad because we do know he is somewhere in this vicinity, but we just cannot find him. We've been looking for 2 hours now, and it's getting to the stage where our feet are killing us, our feet are wet through, same with Vicky. But as you guys know, sometimes we do these stories and we just can never find these locations. A lot of the headstones, don't know if the camera will pick it up, but a lot of headstones here are fallen over and they're covered in grass. And again, it's just making it nigh impossible to locate. So this is another one of those sad stories where we've come to finish the story here and we can't pay our respects to poor Jack and obviously the rest of his family. But it is what it is, unfortunately, and this does happen quite often, and it is sad. These attacks on young children, absolutely horrifying. They're horrific. And especially, obviously, the disappearance of Sheila Fox, and to this day, she has never been found. Her body has never been discovered. She wasn't discovered dead or alive, even shortly after her disappearance. And like I said, it's been 80 years and still no sign, nothing of what occurred to her. You had then, obviously, the escalation. You had the 2 attacks on Patricia and that of Brenda. Luckily, they managed to survive. And I mentioned the word luck earlier, and hopefully you guys know why I use that word. They were extremely fortunate not to, well, to be murdered, just like young Jack Quentin Smith. Now, David Lee, also extremely lucky to survive. I think with the David Lee one, I think his attacker thought he may have killed him. If the police are correct on that, David was attacked before Jack. That would make sense. Obviously, when David regained consciousness and made his way to safety and raised the alert, the alarm, his attacker, he was actually seen running down that railway line, that stretch. Witnesses would say they actually caught him running down that stretch of railway. Still, nobody was charged with these attacks and this murder. My theory, there is a serial killer by the name of Norman William Green, and he took the lives of 2 children in 1954 and 1955. He was arrested, found guilty, and ultimately he hanged for those murders. He had light blonde hair. I think, if I remember rightly, at the age of 25, that is when he was executed. So if you do the maths, he would have been around 18, 19 years old when the attacks of Jack Quentin Smith took place and that of David Lee. Old enough, in my opinion, to have made his way from Wigan to Farnworth and the area where these attacks took place. I would not be surprised if Norman William Green was the person responsible for the murders of, well, the murder of Jack and obviously the attack on David. His profile matches up. He used a knife to kill the other 2 boys. He used a knife. There was a knife used, obviously, on David and Jack. Everything seems to match up. I don't know if the police investigated that line of inquiry. Obviously, when Norman William Green was eventually captured, they may well have done, but I've not read anything to say that. But for me, Norman William Green is, in my eyes, a likely suspect. He was a young man. The witnesses at the time described seeing a young man, aged between 25 and 35. However, an 18, 19-year-old, in my opinion, could well look much older.
And if the kids also said it was age, it's very difficult. These days, even when we're pinpointing people's ages, it is very difficult.
The younger than what they look.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they could quite conceivably have got the age wrong based on just appearances. Jack, like I said, was murdered by this tall man with greyish hair, dark suit, young man. Norman William Green had light, very light blonde hair. I'm not saying grey, but light hair. Perhaps Norman Green is the person responsible for the murder of Jack Quentin Smith. This is just my theory. This is just what I've been thinking of these last few days. But like I said, everything seems to match up to what Norman did to the other two boys in 1954 and 1955. He was a predator. He killed two young schoolboys. The same manner in which Jack and David were attacked. The same manner in which Patricia and Brenda were attacked. Young children.
But do you think it was the same terror to do all five?
Now, going back as to what Vicky's just said, the newspaper, the journalists would nickname this the terror, the Farnworth terror, or the terror of Farnworth. And like I said at the very start, it kind of reminds me of Michael Myers' Haddonfield Halloween. I know that's just a movie, but I kind of got that same feeling with this. They give this character, this unknown character, a bogeyman or a boogeyman name. Mm-hmm. This name, the terror, it kind of dramatises it all. It kind of puts a warning out to other children not to be on their own on these streets, and more so in the 1940s in Farnworth. It kind of struck fear into the heart of parents who wouldn't let the children walk around the streets of Farnworth on their own. And this went on for 4 or 5 years after the Sheila Fox disappearance. Groups were arranged to take children to school in 1948. Parents organised these groups along MacDonald Avenue and other avenues nearby, and children had to walk to school in large groups. After school, teachers, they put groups together, so if a lot of children lived on MacDonald Avenue, they all walked home together for safety and out of fear. But I don't think the press themselves, I don't think they did themselves any favours by bringing out this terminology, the terror. What do you think?
No.
I get why. It sensationalises it, it sells newspapers, I get that. But it mustn't have helped the parents. They must be frightened beyond comprehension that their child might be next. But to this very day, all these stabbings, the murder and the disappearance of Sheila have never been solved. Somebody out there will have known something, obviously the person involved. Do I believe it was the same person? No. I believe Sheila Fox was one case on its own. The other four, on the other hand, I don't know. But I do believe, I honestly think, and like I said, people know more and they're more experts in this, Norman William Green for me is a good suspect for the Jack Quentin Smith murder.
And he went for boys.
And obviously the David Lee story, and he went for boys, young boys. Tell us your thoughts down below. Is it, if you know the story of Norman William Green, could he be a likely candidate for these attacks? And people say, well, what happened between 1948 and 1954? I don't know without looking into Norman's back history. Maybe, like Vicky said before, maybe this person had been arrested. Yeah. He may have been sent to prison or to jail for a few months, maybe a year or two for something, and this is why the attack stopped.
Yeah.
Obviously, we'll never know this. But yeah, tell us your... It is. Tell us your thoughts down below on the Norman William Green theory. Is it plausible? I mean, I presume it is plausible. But tell us your thoughts down below. And also tell us if you've heard of these strange, horrific cases on Sheila Fox and the other two girls. It would be interesting to know your thoughts. Now, there was another interesting person who the police thought may well have been the person responsible for the attacks on Jack and David. And that was a man by the name of Peter Griffiths. Now, the murder of June Ann Devaney, it was a child murder which occurred on the 15th of May 1948, when a girl aged 3 years and 11 months was abducted from her cot while she was an inpatient at the Queen's Park Hospital over in Blackburn, so not too far from Farnworth itself. The child itself was removed to the grounds of the hospital, where she was assaulted before suffering extensive blunt force trauma to her skull, and unfortunately she would pass away from the injuries and the ordeal. Now, Peter Griffiths was 22-year-old at the time, and he was arrested 3 months after the crime was obviously committed. He was subsequently tried and convicted of June Ann's murder, and he was hanged on the 19th of November 1948. However, on the eve of his execution at Walton Jail, The police were given special permission to interview Peter and ask him outright if he was responsible for the murder of Jack Quentin Smith and the attack on David Lee, and he point blankly refused, saying he knew nothing about it and he wasn't the person responsible. Now, the police themselves felt at the time he was telling the truth, and their reasoning being it was the eve of his execution and he had nothing to lose. So that is all here from Farnworth Cemetery, and we do apologise for not being able to locate Jack Quentin Smith's final resting place. It isn't for the lack of trying. Now, don't forget to comment down below if you've heard of these strange tales of Sheila Fox, Jack and all the other victims in this story. If you enjoyed the video, comment down below, tell us your thoughts. We appreciate it's sad, we appreciate it's morbid, and we appreciate that obviously emotions are still raw. And that is why when we're walking around MacDonald Avenue, we didn't stay too long outside the homes of where these people once lived. Just that's out of respect. But please, we hope you understand that this video, this story, it still runs, the emotions still run high in Farnworth, let's just put it that way. But don't forget to stay safe, stay curious, don't forget to share this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we have a lot more coming over these next few months, if not years. We really do appreciate your support. But like I said guys, do all those things and we'll be back soon with more tales from our dark, but at times glorious past.